December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. Japan strikes with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a tsunami. Within months, the rising sun flies over half the Pacific. But beneath the triumph lies a fatal flaw, one that no amount of courage, steel, or blood could overcome. Japan's army and navy weren't just fighting the Allies. They were fighting each other. Two separate wars, two incompatible strategies, one catastrophic outcome. This is the story of how institutional hatred, pride, and a refusal to communicate didn't just weaken an empire, it destroyed it from within. In the decades before the world plunged into war, the Empire of Japan built two of the most formidable military forces on Earth. The Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy stood as pillars of Japanese power, modern, disciplined, and feared across Asia and the Pacific. But beneath the rising sun flag, these two titans were not allies. They were blood enemies, locked in a rivalry so toxic it would ultimately help destroy the nation they both swore to protect. The roots of this hatred stretch back to Japan's rapid modernization in the late 19th century. The army drew its identity from the samurai class, warriors of the soil, steeped in Bushido tradition and the belief that Japan's destiny lay westward, across the Asian continent. Their eyes were fixed on Manchuria, China, and the vast Soviet borderlands. Victory, they believed, would come through the conquest of land, the subjugation of populations, and the creation of a vast empire stretching from Tokyo to the Urals. The Navy was different. Forged in the image of the British Royal Navy, it embraced Western modernity, technology, and global ambition. Its officers studied at Annapolis and Greenwich. They spoke English, drank whiskey, and dreamed not of dusty plains but of blue-water dominance. For the Navy, Japan's future lay to the south and east, across the Pacific, toward the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the strategic choke points that controlled half the world's trade. Control the seas, they argued, and Japan would be invincible. These were not simply different strategies. They were incompatible worldviews, and the men who held them despised one another with a passion that verged on madness. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the rivalry escalated into open warfare, not against foreign enemies, but against each other. Every year, both services fought brutal battles in the Imperial Diet over budget allocations. The Army demanded funding for divisions, tanks, and artillery. The Navy countered with requests for battleships, carriers, and aircraft. Compromise was impossible. Politicians who favored one service over the other were marked men. In 1930, when the Navy agreed to treaty limits on warship construction at the London Naval Conference, Army officers exploded in rage. They saw it as capitulation to the West, a betrayal of Japanese honor. Prime Minister Asachi Hamaguchi, who supported the treaty, was shot by an ultranationalist fanatic. He lingered for months before dying of his wounds. The violence only intensified. In February 1936, over 1,400 Army officers and troops launched a coup attempt in Tokyo. They stormed government buildings, assassinated the finance minister, and hunted down officials they deemed too sympathetic to the Navy's influence or too moderate in their policies. For 4 days, the capital teetered on the edge of civil war. The rebellion was crushed, but the message was clear: the Army would not be restrained. The Navy seethed. They saw the Army as reckless barbarians, fanatics who would drag Japan into unwinnable wars on the Asian mainland. The Army saw the Navy as elitist traitors, corrupted by Western decadence and unwilling to make the sacrifices necessary for true empire. By the late 1930s, Japan's military establishment had fractured into two parallel command structures that barely communicated. The Army General Staff planned operations in China and against the Soviet Union. The Naval General Staff prepared for war in the Pacific. Neither consulted the other. Neither shared intelligence, strategy, or resources. When Japan finally entered World War II in December 1941, it did so with two separate war plans, two separate theaters of operation, and no unified command to coordinate them. The Army and Navy didn't just fail to cooperate, they actively undermined each other, hoarded resources, and concealed vital information. This wasn't dysfunctional, it was insane, and it was baked into the very soul of Imperial Japan's war machine. The question was never whether this division would cause disaster. The question was how soon, how catastrophically, and how many would die because of it. The answers were coming, and they would be written in blood across half the globe. In any modern war, victory depends on integration. Armies must coordinate with navies. Intelligence must flow freely. Supply chains must work as one. The Allies understood this. American soldiers fought alongside British commandos. Royal Air Force pilots flew cover for Australian infantry. Supply officers from 3 nations shared warehouses, fuel depots, and ammunition stocks. Intelligence gathered in Burma reached commanders in Washington within hours. In Japan, none of this existed. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy didn't just fail to cooperate. They built entirely separate war machines, operating in parallel, often working at cross purposes. It was as if 2 different nations were fighting 2 different wars under the same flag. Start with the most basic requirement of modern warfare: logistics. The Army and Navy maintained completely separate supply chains. Army quartermasters controlled rice, ammunition, and fuel for ground forces. Naval supply officers hoarded their own stocks for the fleet and naval infantry. If an Army division stationed near a Navy base ran short of fuel, they couldn't simply request it from their neighbors a few miles away. The request had to go up through Army channels across to Tokyo, then down through Navy channels. The process could take days. More often, it was simply denied. Even the aircraft they flew were incompatible. The Army's Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, called the Oscar by the Allies, was a nimble, lightweight fighter optimized for air combat over China and Southeast Asia. The Navy's Mitsubishi A6M0 was designed for long-range carrier operations across the vast Pacific. But they didn't just serve different tactical roles. They used different ammunition calibers, different fuel mixtures, different maintenance protocols. An Army airbase couldn't service a Navy plane, and vice versa. Worse still, they developed completely separate tactical doctrines. Army pilots trained for close air support, dogfighting, and ground attack missions. Navy pilots mastered carrier operations, torpedo runs, and fleet defense. When circumstances demanded they work together, chaos followed. In China, when Army ground forces desperately needed air cover during critical battles, they had to submit formal requests through the Army General Staff in Tokyo, which would then petition the Naval General Staff. By the time approval came, if it came at all, the battle was often over. Intelligence was no better. The Army ran its own spy networks, its own codebreakers, its own signals intercept stations. The Navy did the same. They refused to share information. In some cases, they didn't even use compatible codes. An Army intelligence officer who intercepted vital enemy communications couldn't simply pass it to a nearby Navy command post. It had to be routed through the proper channels, translated into Navy code systems, and sent through their separate chain of command. This wasn't bureaucratic inefficiency. It was sabotage by design. Japanese military culture was built on the concept of vertical loyalty. An officer's primary allegiance was to his service branch, not to the emperor, not to Japan, but to the Army or the Navy. Promotion, honor, and survival depended on serving your branch's interests, even if it meant undermining the other service or damaging the war effort. On remote islands across the Pacific, Japanese garrisons illustrated the madness in miniature. Army and Navy units stationed on the same piece of coral refused to share defensive plans. They wouldn't exchange maps. In some cases, officers from the 2 services wouldn't even speak to one another. They built separate fortifications, dug separate tunnels, and established separate communication networks. When American forces attacked, the defenders fought as 2 isolated forces, unable or unwilling to coordinate their response. Meanwhile, in the waters between Java and Australia, in the skies over Burma, and on the jungle trails of New Guinea, Allied forces demonstrated what integration looked like. American submarines refueled at British bases. Australian infantry called in airstrikes from U.S. Army Air Force squadrons. Royal Navy intelligence reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters overnight. The Allies were far from perfect, but they understood a fundamental truth. The enemy you're fighting is in front of you, not next to you. Japan had forgotten this, or perhaps it had never learned it. By 1942, Imperial Japan was effectively fighting three enemies: the Americans, the British and their Commonwealth allies, and themselves. Of the three, the last would prove the most relentless. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. Battleships capsize in the oil-slicked waters of Hawaii. Over 2,000 Americans are dead. Half the U.S. Pacific Fleet is on the bottom or crippled. In Tokyo, jubilation sweeps through the halls of power. Japan has struck the first blow, and it appears devastating. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, feels no joy. He has studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled across America. He knows the industrial colossus Japan has just awakened. After Pearl Harbor, he allegedly warns his colleagues that Japan has 6 months, perhaps a year, to win the war. After that, he can guarantee nothing. The Army leadership dismisses such pessimism. General Hideki Tojo, now Prime Minister and Minister of War, believes Japan's greatest weapon isn't steel or explosives, it's spirit. The Japanese fighting man, imbued with Bushido and willing to die for the emperor, will overcome American material superiority through sheer will. Victory, he insists, is inevitable. For 6 months, it seems he might be right. Singapore fell in February 1942, the greatest military disaster in British history. Over 80,000 Commonwealth troops surrender to a Japanese force half their size. The supposedly impregnable fortress collapses in just 7 days of fighting. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces hold out until May, but surrender is inevitable. General Douglas MacArthur flees to Australia, vowing to return. The Dutch East Indies, the oil, rubber, and tin that Japan desperately needs, fall like dominoes. By March 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But beneath the surface, the cracks are widening. The Navy's strategy has always been clear: destroy the American Pacific Fleet, seize the resource zones of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, and force the United States into a negotiated peace. With America's fleet crippled and Japan controlling the oil it needs, Washington would have no choice but to accept Japan's conquests. The Army has a completely different plan. China remains the priority. Over 1 million Japanese troops are bogged down there, fighting a war with no end in sight. And to the north, the Soviet Union looms. Army planners are convinced Stalin will eventually attack, and they demand resources be devoted to defending Manchuria and preparing for a massive continental war. These strategies are not just different, they are incompatible, yet both proceed simultaneously. The Navy hoards shipping, fuel, and aircraft for Pacific operations. The Army diverts resources to China and the Manchurian border. Neither will compromise. Neither will yield. In April 1942, the tension exploded. 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet appear over Tokyo in broad daylight. The Doolittle raid causes minimal physical damage, a few factories hit, a handful of casualties. But the psychological impact is catastrophic. The homeland has been attacked. The emperor himself was in danger. The illusion of invincibility shatters. The Navy is humiliated. Protecting the sacred soil of Japan is their responsibility, and they have failed. They demand immediate retaliation. Admiral Yamamoto proposes a bold plan: lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, destroy them, and eliminate the last threat to Japan's Pacific Empire. The Army dismisses the Doolittle raid as a propaganda stunt, strategically meaningless. They refuse to divert resources from China for what they see as the Navy's obsession with the Pacific. When Yamamoto requests additional land-based aircraft and troops for the Midway operation, Army headquarters delays, stalls, and ultimately provides only minimal support. Meanwhile, American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii have broken Japanese naval codes. They know Midway is the target. They know when the attack will come. They know the composition of Yamamoto's fleet. The Japanese Navy possesses this same intelligence capability. Their own codebreakers have penetrated American communications, but they refuse to share their decryption methods with the Army, who control critical air bases and reconnaissance assets that could confirm American fleet movements. Trust nothing, share nothing, concede nothing. On June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Huryu, converged on Midway. They carry the most experienced naval aviators in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and 100 battles. But American dive bombers are waiting. In just 5 minutes, 3 carriers are burning. The 4th follows hours later. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors die. Japan's offensive power in the Pacific is broken. The disaster is so complete, so devastating, that the Navy conceals it from the Army for weeks. Surviving aircrew are quarantined. Witnesses are sworn to secrecy. Official reports are falsified. The Army learns the truth not from their supposed allies, but from intelligence intercepts and rumors. The two services have now progressed beyond rivalry. They exist in separate realities, fighting separate wars, blind to each other's catastrophes. And the Americans, British and Australians, are only beginning to mobilize. August 1942, Guadalcanal, a steaming jungle island in the Solomon Chain, barely a speck on most maps, is about to become a graveyard. When U.S. Marines storm ashore on August 7th, they catch the Japanese by surprise. The small garrison, mostly Korean laborers and naval construction troops building an airfield, flees into the jungle. The Marines seize the nearly completed runway and name it Henderson Field. For Japan, this is intolerable. The airfield threatens their entire defensive perimeter in the South Pacific. It must be retaken. The Imperial Japanese Army dispatches the first reinforcements, elite infantry from the 35th Brigade, veterans hardened in Manchuria. They're confident, even contemptuous of their enemy. American Marines. They'll be swept into the sea within days. But the Navy, responsible for transporting these troops, has other priorities. The destroyers and fast cruisers of the Tokyo Express, the Japanese call it the Rat Run, make high-speed night runs down the slot, the channel through the Solomon Islands. They deliver troops, yes, but always under cover of darkness, always in minimal numbers, and always with inadequate supplies. The Navy's primary mission isn't supporting the Army's ground campaign. It's protecting their own naval installations, maintaining their logistics network, and preparing for the decisive fleet battle they're still convinced will win the war. Army commanders on Guadalcanal beg for supplies, food, ammunition, medical supplies. Navy transport ships pass within sight of the island, their holds full of provisions, but those are earmarked for Navy bases elsewhere. Requests for delivery must go through Tokyo. Days pass, weeks pass. The requests are denied or simply ignored. The soldiers begin to starve. They call Guadalcanal Starvation Island. Rations drop to a few ounces of rice per day. Men chew on tree bark, boil grass, eat anything they can digest. Malaria and dysentery ravage units already weakened by hunger. Soldiers who survive American bullets and artillery die quietly in the jungle, too weak to move, their bodies consuming themselves. Meanwhile, overhead, Navy pilots flying from carriers and Rabaul fight their own isolated war. They strafe Henderson Field, duel with American fighters and attack supply ships. But they have no radio contact with Army ground forces. They don't know where friendly units are positioned. They can't provide close air support because there's no system to coordinate it. Army officers watch Navy planes fly past their desperate positions, unable to call them in, unable even to communicate. The Americans are doing something entirely different. On Guadalcanal, Marines and Army infantry fight side by side under unified command. Navy warships provide shore bombardment on request. Marine and Navy pilots flying from Henderson Field coordinate with ground controllers, hitting Japanese positions within minutes of requests. Supply ships unload around the clock. Everything flows through one command structure. Intelligence gathered by coast watchers, Australian scouts hidden in the jungle, reaches American commanders within hours. It's not perfect. There are failures, delays, and miscommunications, but it works. The system works. For the Japanese, it doesn't. By November 1942, the Japanese army had poured over 30,000 troops onto Guadalcanal. They launch repeated assaults against Henderson Field. Each attack is ferocious, fanatical, and ultimately futile. American firepower, coordinated between artillery, naval guns, and air support, tears the Japanese formations apart. The Army begs the Navy for sustained logistical support. The Navy responds with more Tokyo Express runs, delivering just enough supplies to keep the garrison alive, but never enough to win. Navy commanders are planning their own operations, hoarding resources for what they see as more important objectives. They won't divert carriers or heavy transports for what they consider the Army's problem. In January 1943, Tokyo finally made a decision. Guadalcanal will be evacuated. For once, the Army and Navy cooperate. The Tokyo Express, in a brilliantly executed series of runs, evacuates over 10,000 surviving troops in early February. It's a tactical masterpiece, executed under the Americans' noses with minimal losses. But it's too late. Over 25,000 Japanese soldiers are already dead. Most didn't die in combat. They died of starvation, disease, and neglect. They died because Navy ships carrying food sailed past their positions. They died because inter-service rivalry was more important than human life. They died because the machine designed to support them was too busy fighting itself. The Americans call their victory at Guadalcanal a turning point. They're right, but for the Japanese it's something else. It's a warning of what's coming, and no one in Tokyo is listening. October 1944. General Tomoyuki Yamashita arrives in the Philippines to take command of Japan's defense. He's 59 years old, a veteran of Malaya and Singapore, the man who forced the British Empire's greatest surrender. Tokyo has given him an impossible mission: hold the Philippines against Douglas MacArthur's returning American forces. Yamashita surveys his forces and makes a cold calculation. He commands approximately 250,000 Army troops spread across the islands. They're undersupplied, poorly equipped, and cut off from reinforcement. The U.S. Navy controls the seas. American air power dominates the skies. A conventional defense will end in annihilation. So Yamashita develops a strategy that might prolong the fight. He'll abandon the coastal lowlands and Manila itself. Instead, he'll withdraw into the mountains of northern Luzon, fortify the high ground, stockpile what supplies he can, and wage a defensive campaign that could tie down American forces for months, perhaps longer. It's not a strategy for victory. It's a strategy for survival and delay. There's just one problem. The Imperial Japanese Navy refuses to comply. Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi commands thousands of naval infantry, shore defense troops, and naval base personnel in and around Manila. The Navy has spent years fortifying Manila Bay, building coastal guns, establishing supply depots, and creating what they consider an impregnable bastion. And Iwabuchi has no intention of abandoning it. When Yamashita orders the withdrawal, Iwabuchi ignores him. The Navy operates under its own chain of command, responsible only to Tokyo, not to the Army general nominally in charge of the theater. Iwabuchi declares Manila a naval defense zone and prepares to fight to the death. Yamashita is furious but powerless. He has no authority over Navy forces. His orders carry no weight. All he can do is withdraw his army units north and watch as the Navy transforms Manila into a death trap. On February 3, 1945, American forces entered Manila. They expect light resistance. Intelligence suggests the Japanese are retreating. Instead, they encounter a fortress. The Navy has rigged buildings with explosives, established interlocking fields of fire, and positioned troops throughout the old city. The battle becomes a nightmare of urban warfare. For 29 days, Americans fight block by block, building by building, room by room. Naval infantry fight with suicidal determination. They won't surrender. They won't retreat. Artillery pounds the ancient stone buildings into rubble. Entire neighborhoods burn. And the civilians are trapped in the middle. The Navy forces, isolated and desperate, commit unspeakable atrocities. Thousands of Filipino civilians are massacred, shot, bayoneted, burned alive. Entire families are slaughtered in churches, hospitals, and schools. By the time the battle ends on March 3rd, over 100,000 Filipino civilians are dead. Manila, the Pearl of the Orient, lies in ruins. Only Warsaw suffered worse destruction among Allied capitals. Through it all, Yamashita's army forces remain in the mountains, 40 miles north. They make no attempt to relieve the city. Some historians call it abandonment. Others call it realism. Any relief force would have been destroyed by American air power long before reaching Manila. But there's another truth. The Army and Navy aren't cooperating because they can't. When Navy officers in Manila request ammunition from Army supply depots in the surrounding areas, they're told the logistics aren't compatible. Different calibers, different systems, no mechanism for transfer. When Army commanders ask for naval gunfire support from the few remaining coastal batteries controlled by the Navy, they're told all guns are reserved for naval operations. What that means when the Navy is surrounded and dying, no one can explain. American commanders initially find Japanese defensive dispositions baffling. Forces that should be concentrated are scattered. Units that should retreat, stand, and die. Defenses that should be coordinated are isolated. Major General Oscar Griswold, commanding the U.S. XIV Corps, later admits he thought it was some kind of elaborate trap. Then his intelligence officers figure it out. The Japanese aren't coordinating because they're not talking to each other. The Americans exploit it ruthlessly. They bypass Army strongpoints and attack Navy positions. They cut supply lines knowing neither service will help the other. They isolate defenders who are already isolating themselves. When Manila finally falls, over 16,000 naval infantry are dead. The Manila Naval Defense Force ceases to exist. 3 weeks pass before the Army reports this to Tokyo. 3 weeks before Imperial General Headquarters learns that the capital of their most important overseas possession has been annihilated. After the war, at his trial in Manila, Yamashita testified about the Philippines campaign. His words are measured, careful, but their meaning is unmistakable. I never had operational control over Navy forces in my area of responsibility. The general commanding the defense of the Philippines had no authority over half the forces supposedly under his command. The Navy fought its own battle, in its own way, and died alone. Manila fell twice, once to American firepower, and once to the poison inside Japan's own war machine. August 1945, Japan is dying. American B-29 superfortresses have burned 67 cities to ash. The firebombing of Tokyo alone killed over 100,000 in a single night. The Navy has been destroyed. What few ships remain hidden in harbors, unable to sail for lack of fuel. The merchant fleet that once connected Japan's empire is scattered across the ocean floor. Millions are starving. And now, two cities have been erased by weapons beyond comprehension. On August 6th, Hiroshima vanished in an atomic fire. 70,000 dead in an instant. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Between these two apocalyptic moments, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declares war and launches a massive invasion of Manchuria, shattering the Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese forces on the continent. The emperor decides Japan will surrender. But even in this final moment, the army and navy cannot agree. Emperor Hirohito records a surrender message to be broadcast to the nation on August 15th. For the first time in history, the Japanese people will hear their emperor's voice. He will tell them the war is over, that continuing the fight would result in the total extinction of human civilization. A group of army officers decides this cannot be allowed. On the night of August 14th, middle-ranking officers from the Army's 1st Imperial Guards Division launch a coup attempt. They storm the Imperial Palace, searching for the recording. They're willing to kill anyone, cabinet ministers, senior officers, even members of the imperial household, to prevent the surrender. They believe Japan must fight to national annihilation, death before dishonor, extinction before submission. The Navy stands aside. What remains of the naval command structure? Officers who have watched their service obliterated refuses to participate. They know the war is lost. They've known for months, perhaps years. Some naval officers actively work to suppress the coup, making phone calls, rallying loyal units, ensuring the rebels fail. By dawn, the coup collapses. The recording is found intact. At noon on August 15th, the emperor's voice crackles over radios across Japan. The war is over. Japan's military possessed extraordinary capabilities. The A6M0 was once the finest fighter in the Pacific. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo was the most advanced naval weapon of its kind. Japanese naval aviation doctrine in 1941 was years ahead of Western thinking. Japanese soldiers and sailors fought with a courage that awed even their enemies. But none of it mattered. Institutional dysfunction destroyed Japan more effectively than any American weapon. Even Germany, whose Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and Luftwaffe competed viciously for Hitler's favor and resources, maintained a supreme command structure. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, for all its flaws, provided a mechanism for coordination. Orders could be issued. Strategies could be unified. Resources could be allocated, even if imperfectly. Japan had nothing equivalent. The emperor was a divine figurehead, not a military commander. The cabinet was paralyzed by inter-service rivalry. Prime Minister Tojo tried to unify the services but failed completely. Each branch answered only to itself, loyal to its own institutional mythology, blind to the larger catastrophe. The human cost is almost incomprehensible. Over 2.3 million Japanese military personnel died. Another million civilians were killed in the fighting. Hundreds of thousands more in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities reduced to ash and rubble. A generation of young men obliterated. An empire that once stretched across half of Asia and the Pacific collapsed into rubble and occupation. In the decades after the war, Japanese historians confront a painful truth. Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, Navy minister during the surrender, reflects on the defeat. His words are bitter. "We were not defeated by America. We defeated ourselves." Post-war studies of Japan's wartime decision-making reveal the depth of the paralysis. Plans that were never coordinated. Intelligence that was never shared. Resources that were hoarded while soldiers starved. Officers who fought each other more savagely than they fought the enemy. The lessons extend far beyond World War II. Organizational culture matters. Communication matters. Unity of purpose determines survival. These truths are as relevant in corporate boardrooms and government ministries today as they were on the battlefields of Guadalcanal and the Philippines. Institutions that turn inward, that prioritize internal politics over external threats, that allow pride and rivalry to override mission, these institutions fail. And when they're responsible for nations in wartime, their failure is measured in millions of lives. Japan's war wasn't lost on June 4, 1942 at Midway, though that battle broke their offensive power. It wasn't lost on August 6, 1945 at Hiroshima, though that bomb shattered their will to fight. It was lost years earlier, in silent conference rooms where cooperation was rejected, in unsigned coordination orders that were never written, in the poisonous belief that institutional honor mattered more than national survival. The Americans, British, and Australians didn't just win because they had more ships, planes, and factories, though they did. They won because when it mattered most, they could work together. Japan couldn't. And so, as the summer sun rose over a shattered empire on August 15, 1945, the war ended not with a bang of coordinated resistance, but with the silence of a military machine that had spent 4 years consuming itself. The enemy hadn't just defeated them. They had helped the enemy by defeating themselves first.